Today, a longtime respected financial professional, David, you started back in 1973 with Cumberland. You've seen an amazing evolution of the markets since then. Monetary policy, Fed officials, fiscal policy, and you somehow became intertwined with Fed officials around the world, central bankers around the world. In this environment we're in, with everything going on, all the conversations about dismissing Jerome Powell and the prevailing shadow Fed, are we entering an era of fiscal dominance?
Wow. Do we have 3 weeks to discuss this? I think the answer is yes. I published a piece on Sunday which tried to compare pandemic finance with war type finance. And there's a distinct difference, even though you have large amounts of debt deficits in both. The interesting responses to that, the piece was based on a study done by the Federal Reserve Bank in San Francisco very early in COVID. And it became the actual trigger for my new book. What it suggests is that in the case of a pandemic, epidemic, a plague, people die. Capital doesn't die. It gets reallocated.
Yep.
Poor people don't inherit very much as heirs because they're a poor household. Rich people who survive inherit from rich people, and you have a concentration of savings. The per capita savings rate goes up. At the same time, you have a shock, and after the shock, you have a reallocation, and productivity per capita goes up. In the old days, you had a farmer. Farmer had 10 fields. There's an epidemic, people die. He no longer needs 10 fields to produce food for the population that remains. What field lies fallow? The least productive field. So productivity per capita goes up, savings per capita goes up, wealth per capita goes up. Think about that context. It only happens when you have a pandemic, epidemic, a plague, a shock. Now flip it to war finance. Deficit's the same. What happens in war? You borrow for consumption. You buy a tank. It's either obsolete the day you take delivery or it gets blown up the day you take delivery. These days, you do it with drones, millions of them. Now, I get debate about this, but I ask the people in the debate, why are there F-16 fighters sitting in mothballs now? Because the F-35 has replaced them. So when you said, gee, every one of them costs so many millions, the whole fleet, billions, yes, and it was consumption. Now, do you get triggers? Do you get productivity gains? Because in wartime, you develop new techniques and then you learn from them. And of course you do, but that comes with a lag. So the answer to your question is yes, because fiscal by definition is expanding use of borrowing by the governing authority. And the question of dominance directs at the purpose. Example, if you borrowed money to build the interstate transportation system and all the highways in the United States, which you and I drive on every day, the productivity gain from that borrowing far exceeds the cost. We move on those highways. What happened? A man by the name of Eisenhower advanced a project that took decades and was financed by the federal government with some from local and state, but this was a federal enterprise. And it is used today, and the productivity gain is enormous, even though we have traffic jams and complain about them and we have accidents and all of that. Think about it, what it would be like if we didn't have an interstate highway system connecting the entire country. Contrast that with the railroads, which were a mess. They didn't even have the same track size in the beginning. They were independent parties. Contrast that with the canals, which are obsolete now. What do we do with canals? We go look at them, we have a picnic, and we go fishing. So, yes, we have made that transition. And the big, beautiful, or ugly bill is now in the law, and we now can put a pencil on it. The CBO says 3.4 trillion. Why does the CBO say 3.4 trillion? Because the politicians, all of them, I'm not just a R or a D, they're all dangerous.
Sure.
Okay, so what did they do? They say, gee, if we only make this provision for 2 years or 4 years, then the CBO by law will only score 2 years or 4 years, not 10 years. Now, I got a question for you, Chad.
Yes.
How many people do you know, casually or deeper, work in some version of the hospitality industry and collect tips? Lots of them, right? You meet them every day. And if you're generous, you leave them tips, even when the service is lousy.
Sure.
Okay? What politician can survive without extending no tax on tips? So it's temporary in the law. So 3.4 trillion of fiscal dominance isn't a bigger number. What's the matter with them? Do they think we're stupid? So if you put a pen on this law and you say, I'm going to make an assumption that everything in that bill is going to be permanent. The 2 years will become another 2 years and another 2 years, but let's take the bill and make it permanent. It's 5.5 trillion. According to the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. That's their calculation. Maya McGinnis's group, I support them in their work. I don't care whether it's 5.5 trillion, 5 trillion, 6 trillion. Those numbers are the same. So the answer to your question, long-winded answer, is yes.
What similarities do you see between this and post-World War II? Other than debt to GDP is very similar to that level now. We saw a fascinating thing occur where government debt started to decline. Do you attribute that to keeping 10-year treasury yields under 4% and letting inflation run faster than normal? And is this something that the Treasury Secretary, currently could go after in this fiscal dominance world, anesthetizing Fed actions?
Well, that is this. I used to say $64 question. Now it's a $64,000 question. We had a little inflation since the show was launched.
Yeah.
So World War II, patriotic Fed maintained the interest rate during the war with an unlimited bid for treasury bills, notes, and bonds. The bonds were of a little different version then, but concept's the same. So the short-term interest rate was 3/8 of 1% on a 90-day treasury bill, and it never moved for 4 years. We fought the war. The long term, a little bit above 2%. There was a funny number because there was a callable 5-year call window on one of the long treasury issues, so it muddies it up. But if you think about an interest rate curve that had an unlimited bid at 3/8 of 1% at 90 days and roughly 2.25% at 20 years. That was the yield curve. It made no difference how much debt the US had to issue. There was patriotic fervor. The inflation rate during the war reached 13%. That was the peak number. Atlanta Fed has a great paper on this. After the war, because there were wartime shortages. Wartime shortages? Oh, are we having tariff time shortages? Maybe. After the war, the inflation rate went to as high as 20% before the adjustment process started to equalize and recalibrate and become steady. The Fed Treasury Accord stopped all this in 1950, 51 was the official date. All that stopped. And the Federal Reserve actively proceeded to a new version of activity, and that is the version of activity that has existed since. And it existed unchanged until the great financial crisis. And then Ben Bernanke faced a crisis. There weren't enough dollars in places in the world. What did he have to do? He had to find a way to have dollars in the hands of Jean-Claude Trichet or Shirakawa in Tokyo. How was he going to do it? He could not lend directly to Bank Paribas. So what did he do? They made a deal at the G20 meeting in November of 2008. And whose idea it was? Trichet. I've spoken to Trichet and Bernanke along the way about this. Trichet is a French gentleman. He's very pleasant. So if you said, I said to him, did you think of that? And he says, we came up with a good idea. And Bernanke, in his own version, doesn't say, Jean-Claude thought of it, I didn't, but he says the same. So what did they do? They said, okay, Fed, you lend to the subsidiary of the French bank, which is an American bank, and we in Europe will take the collateral denominated in non-US dollar form from the bank, take a haircut, and we will secure the Federal Reserve and guarantee the Federal Reserve there'll be no losses. And that was the solution. And it worked. The world was collapsing. So you think about the action of the Fed, Bernanke, and you think about integration with central banks. And you didn't have a Great Depression. We were on our way. All this central bank cooperation. By the way, that's how the balance sheet of the Fed got above currency and bank reserves on the liability side, because it had to get bigger in order to make this transaction. And it's never been able to get back to where it was before the great financial crisis, and it can't.
A lot of stops and starts.
Can't. So all this talk, we got to shrink the balance sheet. Bernanke has said, several times. If leave things alone, the balance sheet will always be growing in size. And the fact is, if we shrink it, we'll only have to grow our way back to it anyhow. He's right. It's a step function. It's not linear. And we have some people in our government that we elect who do not understand these things. And that's part of our system. And it's the job of you and me and others to try to explain it.
On that note, you mentioned something, the interdependence we have with partners, with monetary policy. And we've seen, I'll put up a few slides here, a brash of talk of, the debt crisis we have here in the United States. And I've highlighted some of these dates back in May and April. If China stops buying our debt, will calamity follow? Well, this was in 2010. Is China engaging in large scale dumping of US treasuries, and all the talk of foreign investors sold US treasuries? The challenge, so much so with the media nowadays, these stories exist. And then next thing you know, a month or two later, you actually see inflows. Do you have the concern that foreigners are stepping back entirely from buying US debt?
I don't have the concern that foreigners are stepping back entirely. I do have the concern that the behavior of the United States has diminished the reliability of the relationship in the eyes of the foreigner. And for those of us who talk with colleagues and friends around the world, we talk about this. We're going to talk about this in Maine because this year we have a theme. And the theme is geopolitics and defense and finance. And so we've got 4 panels on it. And one of our special guests is the consul general of a very important foreign trading partner country. So I invited her and I said, this is a private event. Would you come and share your views? And I don't expect her to say anything publicly that is not consistent with her government's position. But Chad, she has agreed to spend 2 more days with us in Chatham House Rule conversation. And for you, you'll meet somebody, by the way, she's near you.
Okay.
She's in Dallas right now. So I have to make sure you guys get in a canoe together.
That's a quick trip up north, but I appreciate that. We'll make it happen.
Yeah. So the answer is we don't help ourselves
Sure.
when we call somebody a name, when we insult somebody. That was the first thing. The second thing is, in the eyes of the entire world, we demonstrate mistakes. The President of the United States sits with his counterpart from South Africa. Now, you can talk about issues, fair game. And he demonstrates what he alleges is an action taking place in South Africa. Now, it had racial tones, it had political tones, has geopolitical obligations, and he chastises the counterpart with a film and said, this is going on in your country. And then it comes out that the film was shot in the Congo. The gentleman from South Africa was a diplomat. But if you were sitting in another country, anywhere in the world, You saw that clip if you were involved in government politics, in geopolitics, in finance. You saw the clip. And you had to say to yourself, how could they do something that makes not, that makes the image of the United States a liar and do it in front of the whole world? You and I ask the same questions. Anybody who thinks about this asks the same questions. That doesn't help relationships. That defeats negotiations and interdependence. It undermines trust and reliability. It says I can sit and negotiate with you, but I can't believe you. It says when we shake hands and have an agreement, the agreement is not the conclusion of the negotiation. It's the first step of the next round of litigation of the negotiation.
I see this as, the symptom we see as a battle across socioeconomic status, education status, which are these echo chambers from media that we all consume that has the ability to really skew the incorrect message with a megaphone. And if you don't have checks and balances in place for that information across all levels, you perpetuate it.
Oh, and intensify it.
Incredible.
And we intensify it. I look at all news media. So why? Do I like some of the messaging? No. I want to see what Rachel Maddow says to her constituency, and I want to see what Sean Hannity says to his constituency. And when there's an event taking place, I flip between the two to see how they're reporting the event.
Right.
When it comes to the news and I want facts and accuracy, I look at Reuters, I look at Bloomberg if it's in the financial area. They are attempting to be politically neutral and report as much as they can. But I look at all of this. And why? Because as we know, the Fox News viewer is looking at Fox News all the time.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
the Rachel Maddow's constituency looking at her all the time. And that's all they're hearing. That's your echo chamber at work.
This is something I've admired. You've had the ability to foster apolitical conversations, which in this environment, it is so challenging with these platforms. Have you seen this exist in the financial markets over your career previously?
I have to say, now I'm an old man, okay? So I'm 82 years old.
Getting less young.
Thank you. You're very polite and kind, but you're a gentleman, and I knew that first time I met you. I think that prior periods of political tension were not as difficult as present day. I think there were fierce debates and discussions as there are today. And I remember being in them when I was younger. At least I have some recollection of it. So I think it's more intense, but that's really a hard one.
Yeah.
Because maybe it's not more intense. Maybe the tools magnify the intensity. I have a piece in preparation that I hope to publish a week from this coming Sunday. And in it, I examine the propaganda mechanics of Joseph Goebbels when he became propaganda minister in 1933 for Hitler. Goebbels was the #2 person. And in researching the piece, I was looking at Goebbels' history. He started out as a local politician in Berlin, and he got into the parliament, the Reichstag, and then when Hitler came to power, he became the minister of propaganda. What did he do? He created a radio. It has a German name, but the translation would be the People's Radio. And they produced it and sold it to the population under production cost. Radio. Now remember, we didn't have the internet then, we didn't have television then, all we had was really radio and print. And he produces this, sells it at a very low price, and enables installment financing for poorer households in Germany and Austria. Remember, this was an expanding operation. The radio was restricted to certain frequencies. So if you had that radio as your source of news, you could not tune to the British Broadcasting Company. You had the state message only. 1933. That's a century ago. I shudder to think, Chad, what Joseph Goebbels would do with the internet, with Grok. What the tools. So is the intensity of the issue the same? I would say the intensity of the issues with Nazi Germany were pretty intense in those days.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And we're 100 years later.
Yeah.
It's the tools that, and our population is not keeping up with the speed of change.
On that note, there's a sort of drumbeat for the messages we hit with, do we lose demand for United States treasuries? You have a younger crowd that wants to have crypto everything. You have a government that is now engaged in stablecoin world. And I'll throw up a piece, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent just issued here on the 18th a few days ago.
Yeah.
With the Genius Act, and what they're after is a surge in demand for those treasuries, which back stable coins. Apollo has put out a piece on what that demand looks like. And, they've found that around 2028 or so, this will create another $900 billion of treasury demand, which, coincidentally is kind of the peak of what we need in that treasury general account. You've seen innovation over your career. What's your view on this new innovation and creating a new buyer of U.S. treasuries?
Well, I saw Torsten's piece, Torsten Slok of Apollo, and I see his work, and he and I have exchanged comments from time to time. He's been up in Maine one time. Didn't catch enough fish, so he's not coming back. We had lessons about bills versus notes versus bonds. There are studies in Treasury which say the overall cost over time would be cheaper to favor more bills. Some of the time that's true. The policymaker, meaning Scott Bessent and of course Trump, think they're going to be able to change Federal Reserve policy to get the short-term interest rate low. So they don't want to issue long. So we're expanding the debt and we're adding the debt incremental issuance in the Treasury bill sector. And whether it's 800 billion or 900 billion of incremental additional bills is irrelevant. It's that kind of a number. The Fed will be able to manage that, in my opinion. because they are managing repo and because we've changed the capital structure for banks to own those treasury bills. I don't believe there's a digestion problem, but there might be some plumbing that has to change in the internals of the short-term finance structure of government securities. I believe the Federal Reserve knows what to do and how to do it, and has demonstrated that they know. My fear comes from the second political bill, not the Genius Act, the new one, because there are people in this world that would like to take a cryptocurrency that is not tethered to the US dollar and use it for payments. And I don't mean a payment between you and me. The greatest structure is something we call legal tender. And in the United States, there's only one way you can pay your tax bill. You can't pay it with a Bitcoin. You can pay it with a picture of George Washington in paper or electronically. The US dollar. And what does the government say? It says, if you bring us your US dollar, we'll replace it with another US dollar. That's the promise. But the US dollar is the way you can pay your taxes. It is legal tender. You can execute a contract with it. You can enforce the contract with it. You can establish a price with it. And the Federal Reserve is charged with maintaining a store of value characteristic. And the only way it can do that is to have a positive real interest rate. That's the only way. Now there's all the gold talk, and I mean all the
Sure.
okay. So it ain't broke. Don't fix it.
We just had a test with the pandemic. What did the world do? They bought dollars.
Why? It's the single most used mechanism, and it has the most credible, stabilized banking and payment system in the entire world. Do you want to use the ruble? I mean, think about that. So there are people who make this argument that we should have the dollar balances down to the size of our GDP relative to the rest of the world. Oh my gosh, why? Would be an act of madness. And we all benefit.
Sure, absolutely.
Every single day. Everybody who's going to see this video benefits every single day by the dollar being the world reserve currency. Why break it? It's fixed. Don't mess with it.
Your book, a great read, by the way. The context of history is just fascinating.
Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. The implications for, what we are experiencing now, in your view, is this kind of the outcome of the pandemic and the response of, and what I mean by that is, the previous administration, deficit spending when we seemingly had adequate capital in the system. Current administration, more deficit spending stacked on top of this. Great historical context. It seemed to me these were all repeating patterns. Is this the same repeating pattern you observed?
In generalities, yes. Okay. In specifics, each one is different, but the themes repeat and repeat and repeat. But you can look at the book. I mean, the book we have, the book is really 4 books. So the whole section on the Federal Reserve and what they did and how it worked. And in the history of the Federal Reserve, there's also the comparative periods when the Fed was younger and didn't do anything. Which way is better? So we structured the book to tell the Fed story in great detail. But we also went to look at antiquity. Did history repeat itself? Well, sometimes it didn't. It was interesting. There's a section on Greece. What happened after the plague in Athens, after the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides has chronicled? What happened after? The Greeks restored the monetary value of the drachma, and it remained the reserve currency of the world in the Mediterranean for several hundred years. They recognized the importance of monetary stability. Now, this is ancient Greece. We didn't have a banking system. The first banks were lending from temples. That's how banking got created to start with. So this is ancient history, but we studied it and examined it for the book. Good for the Greeks. They maintained a democracy and they maintained the currency or the respect for the currency. It happened to be silver, not gold, but that's what they did. What did the Romans do? 3 emperors, 3 plagues, debased the currency, reduced the metallic content, cheapened it, triggered a big inflation, put their picture on it and said, you got to use this coin or I'll cut your head off or feed you to the lions. And that's what that went on for 300 years, 400 years, the decline of the Roman Empire. I have Gibbon's book. I had to look at it to write my book. You think about that history, all the discussion of Rome talks about wars and legions and emperors. And how about the inflation and debasement of the currency, the lack of respect for the monetary system? It gets a little mention. So we face that now in the United States, in the G7 countries, and we have adversaries in the world. One of them's in Moscow. He's ruthless, but he's got friends, and they're not much better. And that they look at us, this marvelous thing called the United States, and they will use our system against us every way they can. And that's the big risk because we're complacent. We always have been as a country. We had to get forced into World War II.
Sure.
Roosevelt couldn't get the Congress to move till an attack took place on Pearl Harbor. I mean, that's our history. That's our nature. And it's something that we worry about. We're going to talk about it a lot up in Maine.
So this, the dollar's depreciated this year with all the policy stops and starts. Did you see this similar type of activity in were places able to pivot and do this in a more measured approach for their own benefit to kind of help their government debt situation?
Well, some did, some didn't. We have real effective exchange rate comparisons. So theoretically, if you have a widget and it's the same widget, its real price in 2 different places should be the same. Theoretically, if there were no restrictions of any type, those prices would gravitate towards each other if only efficiencies in open trade were permitted. Well, that's not the case. That's a theoretical concept. So the issue is how much of a divide is there and who does it? And that's the weeds we're in now. I think the United States could handle debt GDP ratios above the World War II peak. We're going to go there. So we're going to find out if we can handle it or not. I think if we maintain a credible central bank and we don't dismember the Federal Reserve with this personal attacks on its chairman, which is disgraceful behavior, and the policy creates doubt about Fed reliability and independence. Let's assume we don't do that. We talk about it, we threaten it, but we don't do it.
Right.
What's to say we can't have 125 or 130% of GDP as debt, as long as we maintain a positive real interest rate? Doesn't have to be very high, it can be 1 or 2%. But that is the mechanism for value of the currency. You and I are willing to hold a dollar if its buying power is maintained. Otherwise, we go to something else, and the rest of the world is too. I hope and pray we don't destroy such a wonderful invention.
It's the vacuum that I think the appreciation is going to rush towards. That's my take on it.
In the book, are case studies. There are several of them, of what happens when you do and what happens when you don't. And that is 3,500 years of history, including most recently a little piece of COVID. So that's our choice. That's our country. That's our government. That's our investor class. And if we're complacent, we pay a price. And if we aren't, then we overcome the problem. That's what lies in front of us today.
A great time to navigate, for sure. What's the one thing you wish most people, investors, thinkers, the everyday person knew about monetary policy, economics, life, or fishing? Take your pick.
Well, we don't have enough time to talk about fishing, but I'll do that with you in a couple of weeks. We don't teach history in our schools, and we don't study history. And George Santayana, the poet, has a phrase, it's one of my favorite phrases, and it's those who do not remember their history are condemned to repeat it. And that's the nature of the human being. So I wish there were some way to raise the sensitivity to the lessons of history. That's a wish. That's not an expectation, just a wish.
I think that through the work I've seen with the Global Interdependence Center over these past 11 years, that wish is getting spread more and more. It makes a lot of sense. I think the being able to witness the dialogue has been incredible. Thank you for that. Thank you for your time today. Definitely.
Well, it's nice to be with you, and I'll see you in a few weeks, and I much appreciate the time. And if your viewers want to read a serious piece of work, it took us 4 years to write it. And
Where
if
do
they
we
want
get
to, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the book's everywhere now.
Yep, The Fed and the Flu. It's
The
a great read. A lot of charts in the back for people that are visual as well. Great history throughout. David, thank you again.
Nice to be with you, Chad.